Welcome and welcome back, everybody, to the OK Grognard Show. It is Monday, September 27th, 2021, 10 a.m. Central in beautiful Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. Today we're going to look at the Dungeon Master Guide, first edition, Advanced Dungeons and Dragons section on social class and rank in AD&D. It's a interesting section, not without some problematic language, but I think given the time that some of it might be at least understandable, if not let us say up to date. So when we check that out, yeah, here we go. Tell you what, I'm going to slide myself further in the corner. Put baby in the corner? Sure. What do we got here? Yeah. Here's the whole section. We're going to read through some of it. We're going to discuss some of it. And I think the big takeaway from this, if you want the too long didn't read version, it would be social class and rank have as a system, as a subsystem, grafted onto the rules of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons for your setting should be chosen carefully. Grafting it into the rules itself is potentially problematic. Gary realized this. He has a way of expressing it that is straightforward for himself and his time. So we'll go through it and we'll discuss portions of it as we go, make a little commentary, and move right through it. So, social class and rank in Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. The section begins. There is no random table for determination of a character's social status to be found here. That is because the inclusion of such a factor will either tell you little or nothing of useful nature, or it will abridge your freedom with respect to development of your campaign milieu. I think I'm looking for 4 times of using the word milieu in this section, so if you're keeping track of that, there you go. He continues, that is, if such a table tells you only a little so as not to force a social structure upon your campaign, the table can contain nothing of use. Well, that's pretty straightforward. He says, if it states rank, it presupposes you will, in fact, have such classes in your campaign when you might not desire them at all. There are dozens of possible government forms, each of which will have varying social classes, ranks, and castes. Which sort you choose for your milieu is strictly your own prerogative. While this game is loosely based on feudal European technology, keyword there, history and myth, it also contains elements from the ancient period, parts of more modern myth, and the mythos of many authors as well. Within its boundaries, all sorts of societies and cultures can exist, and there is nothing to dictate that their needs be feudal European. So I think if you've ever seen Appendix N in the back of the DMG, you know that Gary was a fan of great swaths of science fiction and fantasy fiction, and that it influenced a lot of what became the rules of Dungeons and Dragons and thereafter Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, first edition in this case. He continues, in The Dragon, that is, magazine, number 25, volume 3, number 11, May 1979, and let's not forget, the DMG was delivered to the public later in 1979, so that article, while it predates the actual publication of the Dungeon Master's Guide, it certainly was written at the same period when he was developing this information here, so you'll see a lot of the information that's in this particular section of the Dungeon Master's Guide echoed in that article, should you get a hold of it and check it out. In the Dragon magazine, there appeared an article written by me, says Gary, which outlines this very precept and lists a number of government forms which could be employed by the DM in his or her milieu. Actually, some, all, or none of them could appear in the world of any given campaign. To aid the harassed referee, rather than Dungeon Master, he goes to the old term referee, which was used in original Dungeons & Dragons and in wargaming in general. I have listed these forms again. Additionally, a list of nobility or authorities in various medieval cultures is given. He continues by saying, I have included the latter as many DMs prefer to base their campaign upon a society of this sort, for they can then draw upon its historical data for game purposes. Once a set of social structures and cultures has been devised for the campaign, you may or may not find it useful to assign ranks, class, and caste to player characters. Good morning, George, Bob. Thanks for stopping in. Bob is formerly known as Henry Armitage, as he's reminding George who he was previously. We'll change it back next month. Keep it. Good to see you both. Gary continues by asking some questions. Will your society have hereditary rank? Will it go only to males, females, both equally? I think we can add, depending on what cultures and societies you're ingraining in your campaign, whether even gender in this day and age is something you want to delineate as structured in what was assumed back in the day. Will only the firstborn inherit? Will any inheritance of property be required to be the entire estate to one individual? Deciding government form and culture might well delineate much of the social structure of the nation, state, or city in question. Let us assume a social structure of an aristocracy which is non-hereditary. Members of this ruling class are those who have served in the military, own property of 100 or more acres extent, and pay an annual tax of not less than 10 gold pieces on their income. Now we're throwing economics into the mix because in a lot of campaigns, 10 gold doesn't seem like a lot. Land ownership may be waived. Land ownership may be waived in the case of merchants and tradesmen whose business is such that they pay not less than 20 gold pieces in taxes each year. Again, the economics may be throwing off some of the ability to picture what he's describing, given a lot of campaigns are going to have wildly different economics. In any event, the aristocrats are the only persons eligible for any government office, command of the military, and from their number are elected senators who pass laws and legislate in general. Former senators are eligible to election to various tribunals and judgeships. Former military officers are appointed by senatorial vote to keep the peace and police the land. So we unpacked a little bit along the way, but again, if a lot of this assumes a certain style of culture or a certain style of law being used within a setting, I think it's fair to also point out at this point that while that might be something you utilize within one section of a game world, there's no reason to say you can't have a myriad of different government styles or forms being represented in various parts of your campaign setting. And so some of this assumes one type, but it could be all over the place, really. He continues, the majority of citizens of this state are small landholders. And again, he's using all of this section to give an example of what might be chosen. The majority of citizens of this state are small landholders, tradesmen, and various workers. They provide the food and goods and labor which make the economy stable. These people are likewise obligated to serve in the military, and if they serve with distinction, they will be awarded land or stipends which will elevate them to the aristocracy. Of course, industry, marriage, or other means can move any of these citizens to a higher status. Only a few persons are actually enslaved, and this looks further back, at least in the sense of medieval feudal European roots back in, say, ancient Rome, since we're talking about a Western civilization mindset for this example. Only a few persons are actually enslaved, criminals and captives of war. The Roman economy, obviously, very, very prodigious amount of slavery involved in that. We often hear more about things like the slave rebellion, which started with the gladiators, Spartacus and his ilk, but it was widespread for agricultural portions of the economy and all sorts of labor, even within large cities like Rome itself. But all of that evolved in a way toward feudal society where some limited rights were granted, as in not being moved around, being able to stay with your family, but nonetheless a sort of form of slavery in being tied to the land and still producing goods which were mostly still the property of the aristocracy. A large number of the workers are bound to labor for a fixed period, and some must likewise serve apprenticeships. These individuals have the hope of eventually earning sufficient funds to become landowners or rich merchants or tradesmen themselves. It's kind of a glossing over of the situation as it existed, and when it says have hope of eventually, the hope was scant, and the number of times that individuals were able to elevate themselves few and far between. And let's continue. In such a society, adventurers would come from the younger children of aristocrats, those who inherit little and wish to remain in the favored class. Some would come from the middle group, adventurous persons who aim at becoming members of the aristocracy through successes in such adventures. Few, if any, would come from the lowest class, i.e., the bondsmen and common laborers. Assigning a social class to player characters in such a society would not have any particular value unless you also devise various rivalries within the classes. I think that's a point well made. If you are going to include a structure like this within your campaign, you're definitely looking at a lot of additional work that needs to be done to make that a meaningful addition to your campaign world for the sake of player characters and adventurers. Gary sums it up with with this brief example in mind, it is easy to see how pointless it is to blindly plug in a set of birth tables based on some form of heredity, quasi-European nobility, which may have absolutely no meaning within any of the states of your campaign milieu. Furthermore, any use of such material must be carefully considered, even if your campaign does have such a society and titles of rank. Viz., do you really believe that one of your player characters should be the firstborn son of a major noble or a ruler? If so, why is he adventuring? Where are his guards and retainers? Does his father know his whereabouts? If so, why is he allowing the heir to his title and estates to risk his life in such a foolish manner? Similarly, do such tables have a logical precedent and order? Are there offices which do not logically belong within a feudal society? Are there classes which are contradictory, anachronistic, and meaningless? Unless you specifically tailor your milieu to fit such tables, it is likely that there will be far too many yes answers to the above questions. The intelligent verdict must be that each DM has to accept the responsibility of deciding for himself or herself if assigning class distinctions is a vital part of his or her campaign. If such is necessary, then the DM must further accept the work of devising his or her own logical birth tables drawn from a society, culture, and government form developed to fit the overall milieu. This is unquestionably a tall order. Those referees who lack time will find that it is perhaps better for them to utilize one of the several campaign scenarios commercially available, adding personal touches, of course, but basically relying on the cultural and societal developments of the unit. Even with such ready-made campaign settings, you may or may not wish to include social classes immediately for player characters. Gary says, my own Greyhawk campaign, for example, assumes all player characters. Parenthetically, he says, unless I personally place one who is otherwise, assumes all player characters are freemen or gentlemen, or at worst, they can safely represent themselves to be so. Parenthetically, he adds, note that the masculine/human usage is generic. I do not like the terms free creatures or gentle beings. That is to say, he is not assuming in gender, or indeed, as they would say in AD&D, race, let's say species, to be necessarily cut in stone within anything you graft in as a cultural or societal uh, appendage to a setting that you are creating. I think we can generously say that Gary is recognizing those points of inclusivity even here in 1979 when he's writing this, even if some of the language he uses while fighting through this section might be considered problematic today. He clearly understands that it's something that can and possibly should be addressed in any individual's campaign setting, and he is making pains here to be sure that that is understood from his point of view as well. To continue, outstanding activity can and has brought knighthood or social status to certain characters. This was carefully planned as a reward if the characters succeeded, and it now allows them much latitude of action and assurance of reliable aid in certain realms, but it likewise has earned them the enmity of others. With all that out of the way, consider the list of a few of the possible government forms and then the list of noble offices, official titles. So, looking back on this before we get into government forms, and indeed, I'm not sure we really need to. This is a section that is, I don't want to say fairly, yeah, let's say it's pretty broad sweeping here. He discusses a lot of different government forms. Uh, I think it's important. I think probably the most important thing that you can take away from this is if you start your campaign and start your players in one section of your game world, even if you include all of these other government forms in different sections of your game world, if you start your player characters and your campaign off in one section of that game world with a particular government setup, government form, with a particular cultural makeup, with a particular societal outlook, that is undoubtedly going to um, influence the tone and of the entire campaign. Um, it's going to be seen at least early on by your players as the flavor of the campaign, even if they're wide traveled later and experience a lot of other societies, government forms, and cultures within the campaign world. They will, by necessity of wanting a sort of a touchstone or something to think of as normal for their characters, for the player characters, they are definitely going to look toward wherever you start them, wherever they start, even if it's random, even if you randomly roll where they're from and who they are. And even if they're, as player characters, from different sections, the place where you start the campaign is going to seem as if it is meant to be the normal place, the baseline, if you will, for their beliefs and understanding of the world at large. So consider all of that as on top of choosing whether or not to have social orders and ranks and castes within your game world. If you're going to impose all of that onto the player characters straight from the get-go, then they're going to embrace that. They're going to see that as what the campaign, and you by extension, think of as the baseline. Uh, you can tell them they're all fish out of water in a part of the world that none of them are from originally, and it will nevertheless seem like a something that they are at odds with if it is very different from what you tell them were the cultures whence their characters came. So, let's have a quick look at the chat over here. Bob says social order and whatnot. I find all of that kind of thing much easier to deal with if I have only 3 or 4 players. Once I get beyond that, I lose the capacity to make it relevant to all the players and keep everyone engaged. Absolutely true that the more players any DM has within their campaign, the less individual time you're going to have to flesh out uh, those sorts of flavorful moments for them to connect with your game world. So be careful of that. George says Gary shared a lot of advice and experience from his actual table play and player interaction. Always a good read. Yeah, I think we often forget that as much as Gary is expounding on what he wants or thinks first edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons should be by the book, by rules, or at least by guidelines, um, that he's not inventing this whole cloth sitting by him, little old self in a room. Thank you for stopping by, Bob. He is feeding off his half a decade, maybe a little more, experience of running games, um, often with, at least at first, with pre Dungeons and Dragons rules guiding him, and all of these Appendix N influences kitchen sinked into the setting that he's creating. Well, he does narrow the focus to his Greyhawk campaign. It's worth noting that Greyhawk is an amalgamation of not just medieval European tropes, but those from many fantasy author fictions and novels and so forth, campaign settings uh, that he played in with other game masters from time to time, or those that he observed or heard about through uh, letters and exchanges at conventions, and even just locally with the other people that ran campaigns in his beloved town of Lake Geneva. So, I think we'll wrap this up for the day and say that this has all been an interesting look into the mindset of Gary as it pertained to creating a setting with social class and rank in AD&D as the focus. I want to thank everybody for popping in today, those who popped into the chat, and let us also say, hey, there's Sarah. How you doing? Thank you for that. Don't forget, we do a show every Monday at 10 a.m. Central. The show streams live on Twitch each Monday at 10 a.m. Central and is then archived on YouTube. If you're checking out the show live on Twitch, by all means, please do subscribe to the channel, chime in on the chat, and we'll see, hopefully be able to incorporate some of what you contribute in the chat stream into the show, questions or insights or any sort of comments you might make in that regard. If you're actually checking this out on YouTube, please do also subscribe to the channel and click the little bell so you'll get updates when we do upload new videos. Please do give a thumbs up to any videos you watch and enjoy, and also feel free to make comments. Chime in on the theme or subject of the day or just general notes on making the show better. It's always appreciated. This has been the OK Grognard Show from beautiful Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. Bye-bye.